Thank you, Dale. I'm probably one of the few people who are glad to hear him support the Ohio State Buckeyes. Since I lived 11 years in my life in Ohio, I guess that qualifies me to say that. But we appreciate the introduction, appreciate you. I love this church. Our family moved here. I get teary-eyed because I love this church so much. In June of 1960, I was 9 years old. I had been making a promise to the preacher at the Knoxville Baptist Tabernacle, where we had been going to church, that I was going to be a Baptist missionary. I'm glad that didn't work out. We moved here in June of 1960, and there's a fellow named Arnold Moore that kept coming over to my dad and said, "You need to go to church, you need to go to church." And he was in bowling business, traveling all over, and finally he talked my dad into letting, how many of these 6 kids can read? He said, 3 of them. He said, "I'll take them, I'll adopt them." And so Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night for some 5 years, he and other people at Carnes brought us here to get us started in the faith till my dad, a wayward Christian, finally came back home in a gospel meeting of 1965. And so how blessed I was to be able to be raised in this wonderful congregation and to see how much good they've done. That man right over there, Jerry Hogg, was influential in my preaching, so if you don't like my preaching, you can start out blaming him. Because he was a missionary, and when it first came, I didn't know who the hogs were that they were praying for, but we soon found out, and I've had the privilege of being over to South Africa with Jerry a couple of years, and just, I don't know any brother in the brotherhood that's been a more successful missionary than what Jerry and Ann have. So I'm privileged to see him. Good to see my brother Craig do a great job. I was bragging on him a text. He didn't believe I was sincere, but I am. And see these students that are here, and I'm looking forward to getting with Ethan when he graduates. I want to get with him a couple of times, maybe every 2 or 3 months, where I can pick his brain and learn what I'm supposed to be doing that I haven't done right the last so many years. But I don't know where I would be if it wasn't for the church here. It changed my life, and that's what it's all about. I want to read a couple of passages of Scripture. I want to read it. Here's the first assignment. Where am I reading this from? I'm not going to tell you where it is. See if you're familiar with this passage. You may be. "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes.'" You want to know where that is? 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I wonder how many times the average Christian has heard that passage in preparation for the Lord's Supper. It's a great passage and needs to be read. Let me read another passage, see if you can tell me where it is. "Now concerning the collection of the saints, as I've given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up, as he may prosper, that there be no collections. When I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. If it's fitting that I go also, they will go with me." Anybody know where that is? 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Our brethren know the first passage I read far more than the second, and that's the problem. I've been given the assignment, giving to the Lord. What a great passage. When you read passages like, well, turn with me to the book of Acts, chapter 11. There were hard times living in the church in the first century. There were natural disasters sometimes that happened. We read of one, thus the need for taking up a contribution. In Acts chapter 11, beginning in verse 27, Luke records for us these words, "In those days the prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea." And people did that. One more passage. Turn with me to the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Along with the church at Corinth, we find in Paul's second letter, the church at Corinth, an example of the churches in Macedonia. By the way, before I read this, And I read 1 Corinthians 16 a few minutes ago. Does anybody know the verse that precedes that? Do you know the verse? Well, let me give you a hint. It's the great resurrection chapter. That might help. Concludes by verse 58. Anybody quote it? Therefore, my brethren, be ye what? Steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your work of the Lord is not in vain. And then the next verse, he talks about money. You think there's a connection there? Well, let's make the connection. That's what we want to do. We'll see the word abounding several times. We see it here in this passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed in the churches of Macedonia, that in great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded, I mean big numbers, abounded the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, employing us with much urgency, that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God. There's the key. We see this passage, they first gave themselves to the Lord. Of all the 5 acts of worship, the probably one that's most neglected is the contribution. Everybody see what happens normally, now especially after COVID, we don't pass the plate. There are baskets at the door when you leave, a prayer is prayed, and just a few minutes of thought. You remember how it used to be when they passed the plate? If you have, Lord's Supper at the end of the service, there's the Lord's Supper and then the contribution. That's when the mamas put all the food cups up with the kids and start picking things together and getting ready to do what? Well, go home. Not that much thought and consideration is given to the contribution, and that's sad. That's sad. That's what needs to change. When I first saw the assignment given and said, well, why that one? But the more I studied, the more I realized there's a reason for that. And I'm glad now of all the topics I get to talk about this one, about giving to the Lord. I heard this sermon probably shortly after I finished school about 3 kinds of people in the world. And I know my students have heard this. There are people that we would call takers. If you got it and they want it, they're going to find a way to get it. A lot of them are in jail or on the way to jail, and there are people who may not be in jail that, they're very selfish. They don't care about people. And there are some people like that. The vast majority of people are what I call traders, Traders. If you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's easy to be nice to people who are nice to you. But the last majority, and there are only a few of them, those are the people who are the givers. They hold churches together. They hold families together. If there are not enough of them, the nations aren't held together. Those are people who, regardless of the condition of what your heart may be, they're the ones who are always there to give. We might see first examples of that at home. Anybody sick all night? Who stayed with you? Probably most of you were blessed. How about your mom? I mean, she'd be the one who'd stay up, no matter what was going on. And, I don't know how many bicycle wrecks I had, but Evel Knievel was a bad person to use as a hero when I was riding bicycles down Pinell Lane at 32 miles an hour. But I never once, when I fell off that bike, said, Daddy! It's always my mom. I think you understand that. That's the way it works, because Mama, nothing like sitting on her lap, because I knew she was a giver. She knew how to give. Christianity is the giving religion. God is the ultimate giver. For God so loved the world that he did what? That he gave his only begotten Son. Before we fix the problems of giving, we've got to fix the problem of raising up a generation of people who are willing first to be a giver. And that's not easy. Because to be a giver, you have to have a heart that's on fire, a heart that's understood this great concept of love. Now, the students at the school know this passage because it was required memory work for them. Ephesians chapter 3, one of my favorite passages. Here's the Apostle Paul writing a letter to the church at Ephesus. They've been around for a while. He had this prayer request for them. He wanted them to be rooted and grounded in something. He wanted, as in fact, Mark mentioned that passage this morning about the Holy Spirit, how he wanted it to be helpful to them. Look at verse 14, if you will, Ephesians chapter 3. For this reason I bow my knees to the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named. He will grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Those students in my class know. I believe that faith must dwell in the heart. I talk about intellectually. There are things we can understand. But when you've gone through the trials of life and see the gospel work, then you have it here. And that's what Paul was praying for in that verse, that Christ may dwell in your hearts. And then he mentioned about being rooted and grounded in the knowledge of the love of God. That's what's missing in the church today, brethren. So remember, Christians are not rooted and grounded in the knowledge of the love of God. So I'm sure all of you are going to get the lectureship book. The next 10 or 15 minutes is free stuff. It's stuff that I wanted to add to it that may help you, because what we need is people who are rooted and grounded in the knowledge of God's love. There are 4 things. And then we'll draw the conclusion that the required 2 in the book. When did you really begin to understand that you were loved? Anybody here raised by tough parents that would say no when you wanted to say yes? That had to work? I've told this to my students. When I was about 11 or 12 years old, my dad brought home a lawnmower. And I thought, man, we'll be able to cut the grass pretty fast with 2 lawnmowers, about an acre lot. I said, no, that's not for cutting this grass. I signed you up for 3 yards. There are 3 neighbors' yards. You're going to be cutting grass for all summer. I thought, whoa. And back then in 1961, you know what, $3 a yard, $3, I got $9.50 every 10 days. I was the richest kid on the street. And I was counting my money one time about the end of July, and my dad said, how much you got? And I told him. He said, well, you'll probably need a little bit more. You're going to be buying your school clothes here in a few weeks. I thought, I've been set up. I thought it was my job. I thought it was my money. And that's not the way it was. I mean, he was teaching me the value of, anybody old enough to remember Dobie Gillis? What was, work, and so forth. And so my dad was introducing me to the concept of work. And I'm glad I wasn't a girl, because my sisters they babysitted every snotty-nosed kid in Corinth, I'm convinced. They would take an iron. By the time they were 11 or 12 years old, they were great ironing. And when we go on family vacations, when we got to go, you know where part of that money came from? We had to get it ourselves. You know what he was doing? Teach me the value of work. I thought when I was 16, I was going to get a driver's license. Back then, in 1969, Oak Ridge Highway was a drag strip. There were 16 people down in this stretch of highway over 1 year. And I thought, well, 16, I'll take my turn. No. I was almost 18 before I finally got my driver's license. And my dad gave me you got to Google 1967 Olds Delta 88. You couldn't get 70 mile an hour of the thing off a cliff. What was he doing? And we were at war for a while. He was my hero for a while. Boy, when I got to be a teenager, I thought I'm a lot smarter than this old man, and told him that, such and such thing. By the time I got up to my mid to late 20s, when I realized my dad had learned a lot in that period of time. I wrote him a letter that he treasured. You know, kind of tongue-in-cheek, Dad, how smart I've finally learned that you become. You know what I was doing in that letter? You know what I was acknowledging? Thank you for making me suffer the way that you did. My wife, Rita, has a son who's a doctor in Memphis. Josh is his name, his first name. This kid didn't sleep for 3 years, from what she says. I mean, it took a long time for he finally slept all night long, and he got paid back because his daughter didn't sleep either. He finally called Mom and said, how'd you do it, Mom? You know what he's realizing? He was realizing, that's what I was realizing too, most of you probably realize it, when did you really know how much your parents loved you? When you got old enough to experience the same kind of heartbreak that your own kids were causing you. Here's the first thing that helps somebody get rooted in knowledge and the knowledge of God's love. What it cost. When you really begin to understand what it cost, you begin to understand the love of God. Jesus said, if I be lifted up in the earth, what will I do? I'll draw all men to me. What is it about the drawing power of the cross? It's because of what he was willing to do. You see him there hanging on the cross. What was it like? Mankind was at its worst. You couldn't imagine a scene of men more evil, just celebrating, happy. Save yourself if you be the Son. Come down, for we'll believe you. I mean, here's humanity in the worst degree and hatred of sin. What was Jesus saying in response? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. In Luke's account, chapter 24, the Lord met up with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. They were leaving town. Their hopes had been dashed. And he made the statement there in verse 25, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things? See that? The idea of a suffering Savior was foreign to them. They had it all figured out, even the disciples. And we mentioned the class, over there with the evangelist students. Matthew 16, Matthew 17, Matthew 20, Jesus keeps saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'll be killed by the hands of the high priest, but I'll be what? Raised the third day. We got that. That's not what they got. And Peter, the first thing you think he got it, because since he said that, Peter said, oh Lord, let it not be. And what did the Lord call him? Get behind me, what? Satan. But see, he never owned up to that. And they were fighting all the time, arguing as to what? Who would, even in Luke chapter 22 there, when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, they were still arguing who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. What was that kingdom going to be like? It's going to be great. Power, finally. Israel restored to prominence. They'd be way up. Can you imagine Matthew chapter 20 when James and John mother come up to Jesus and said, I got this request of you. Put my sons on the right and left hand. The other guy saying, what, man, this is cheap. Did they set her up to this? They said, you don't understand what you're talking about. And today, people just like that. Jesus is not what they're looking for by the Lord. Is this great assistant in the sky that'll give them what they want on their own self-chosen path to glory. That's not what it's all about. It's about giving. Read Isaiah chapter 53. We don't take the time today, but read Isaiah chapter 53. All the words of torture, all the physical pain that he went through for you and for me. And when you begin to understand that, then maybe 1 John 4:19 will help you. We love him because why? He first loved us. And so it helps us to appreciate what it costs things. In the church, there are people that have suffered for me and sacrificed a lot for me. I've been at Wooddale for 23 years because that church has done more for me than any other church I've ever known of. They've been there for me. I'm not just their preacher. I'm like a son. I'm like a father to some. We're close. We're family. We're sacrifice. Anybody ever heard of a preacher by the name of Charles Hodge? He preached years ago. I heard a tape. Never got to hear him live, but he was at some lectureship. And he was asked, what's the secret of success? He preached at Big D in Texas, Duncanville, Texas, not Dallas. But they asked him, what's the secret to your success? You know what he said? I show up. I show up. It's been amazing down through the years, all the people the Lord has showed up for me. He sent givers, all kinds, for the last 38 years of my preaching. And that's one reason why the Lord wants us to get our hands dirty in the lives of other people. Because you just come in and sit and don't do that. The church is intended to be the best, helping organization in all the world. I mean, AA's help some people, but not like the church can. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, God is identified as the God of all comfort. What does he do? Who comforts us in all our tribulations, that we may be able to do what? Comfort someone who's in any need with the comfort that we've received from God. And there are people who've suffered and sacrificed for me. And I know that. It wasn't just the cross. There's hardly a day that goes by. When my wife got sick years ago in 2004, she spent 6 months at Vanderbilt Hospital and finally died of leukemia. There's someone who said, I don't even remember who it was, somebody at Carnes, said, Bill, if you're paying attention, you'll see more expressions of the God's love there than any place you'll ever see. You know what? He was right. We found out we was going to have to go to Vanderbilt to have a stem cell transplant. We found out you're going to have to live here. There's a place on campus that you have to live here. What does it cost? The apartment rent was $1,800 a month. That's a lot of money back in 2004. We didn't have the money for that. I thought, is she going to die because we can't even afford to go to Vanderbilt? But our elders started writing letters to our brotherhood, and they sacrificed. And $45,000 was raised so we could go. It cost people, but God provided. Givers were sent my way in my life, and I'll never live long enough, I feel, to pay off the debt they've given me. So the first thing we need to understand about love is what it cost. We must come to know how little we also deserve this love. How little we deserve. Anybody know Romans 5 verse 8? Because, here's the King James Version, that's the way I remembered it at school years. God commends his love toward us while we were what? While we were yet sinners. He died for us. I was talking to somebody today about, going through the school, and they started the school in 71. In the spring, I started that fall, 19 years old, 52 years ago. I'm only 39 now, you do the math. But at the end of that first day, I made this for Lord, I don't care what you got to do. I want to be a successful gospel preacher. Make my heart tender for people. You know what he did? He heard it. And we'll talk about the fiery furnace, turned it up. I didn't get out of school before things went downhill fast. I got through school, preached for about 6 months and quit. Hung around Knox a little bit longer, and I woke up on May 1st, getting ready to celebrate my anniversary, in the Navy. I was a modern day Jonah. And my dad called me Jonah. I had his name, William, Bill. He started calling me Jonah until that submarine spit me on dry land. I was ready to preach then. But you know how grateful I was? Because all those years, going riding that stinking submarine to sea for 5 years, I thought I blew it. I got to preach and I blew it. I walked away from the church. I was a prodigal son. I was a heathen. Well, all those Navy people had words that sometimes I can't believe it even come out of my mouth. I was mad. I thought God was going to protect me. I tell you, I know what it's like to be a preacher who was a prodigal son. And when I finally got the chance, I said, Lord, I'll not blow it this time. And for 37 years, I've had the privilege of preaching. And so when Paul says, I am what I am by the grace of God, you know what? I understand what that means. Because I know I don't deserve what he's given me. Do you feel that way? Nobody deserves it. You want to get to the point where you understand the depth of God's love, you need to understand that. Number 3, we need to understand the greatness of his gifts. How great it is. Now, if you had a spouse who died, which I did, and you get a $100,000 life insurance policy, I never said, well, that's a great life insurance company because I paid the dues. They owed me that. But it's what God gives you, the great gifts. Anybody ever, there's a passage in Mark 14 that talks about Mary. Remember what she did with that alabaster flask of ointment? How much is that worth? 300 days of work? And people say, what are you doing? This is crazy. I saw a lesson. It was entitled Extravagant Love. Boy, that's what it was. She's done what she could. Lord said she'll always be used as an example. You ever been on the receiving end of extravagant love by the brethren? I learned this lesson. I've been preaching very long. I started the final quarter of my first year going to Monticello, Kentucky. My first Sunday, there were 19, and we'd already grown up to 25 or 28 by Christmas of that year. And I was going up there Sunday morning and Wednesday night. That's a long way it took. I got home at midnight on Sunday and midnight on Wednesday night and stayed up half the night doing my schoolwork. But those people knew the sacrifices. And I was told the weekend before the Sunday close to Christmas, come up early, there's a men's shop. Gave me the address there in Monticello. They got something for you. I said, okay, I probably need a shirt. I did need a shirt. Somebody said you could read the newspapers at the seat of my britches. It was so thin. I needed clothes. I mean, I was probably the poorest student there. But I thought, okay, man, I need a shirt. I get there, and the guy says, we've been expecting you. And I said, well, where are the shirts? He said, no. You're getting a suit. I couldn't believe it. You know, when I said, you know, sometimes on Easter I get a little suit when I was a kid, but we didn't go to the cheap places. The nicest suit in that place I got. And there's a guy who was staying late because I was supposed to wear that suit the next morning. And so he got it all fitted out. I thought, man, this is something. I thought, well, that's just one. But no, there's money left over. You get a shirt and a tie and a belt. Anybody know what Florsheim shoes are? I got Florsheim shoes. I was decked out to the Ritz. And I was supposed to wear that the next morning. I was so shy then I pretty much read every word that I ever preached up there. That Sunday morning is different. I stood right there. And it came from my heart. Tears are running down my face. Here these poor farmers, dairy farmers and all that, put their money together. Today's probably cost over $1,000 because they wanted me to have all of that. To me, that was extravagant love. My brethren did that for me. I learned a lesson. You know who arranged all that? My Lord did that. He's arranged all kinds of blessings for every Christian who would ask for them, who would look for them, who would work for them, if they were willing. And that's what I hope the church learns. Psalm 63 verse 3, because your loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall pray. You know who said that? David said that. You know what he was doing at the time? He was on a run for his life from Saul. Started out pretty good with Saul, you know the story, but after a while, jealousy entered in. Jealousy could be a rough thing. He's on the run. One commentator, I hadn't added up, 13 years. I mean, here's a guy that already been told, you're going to be the king. You sure don't act like it, look like it. What was God doing? He was learning. It didn't make him bitter, it made him better. And all that time he was praying, getting closer and closer and closer to God. And even though he was there, sometimes hiding out in a cave, he understood how great God was. So he could say, because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall pray. You know why we don't do evangelism? Because we don't see the love of God. If you understand the love of God like David did, like I do, nobody's going to shut you up. That's the problem. The lessons about giving to the Lord. Our pocketbooks will follow where our heart goes. Until we get that first, we're going to miss it, brethren. And for these young preachers here, tell people the importance of giving, to be a giver. But you won't learn that unless you learn that God is a giver first. Come to know the greatness of his gifts. Finally, number 4 means come to know the freedom with which we're loved. There are people who do things. My mama had to take care of me. There were 6 of us. But when someone does it because they want to do it, all the difference in the world. John 10:18, Jesus said, no one takes my life from me, but I'll lay it down of myself. And that's what he did. I wish I could have had an hour for each one of these, but what does this all mean? There's some lessons there from the book that I want you to, you get the book. 3 things. A contribution must be embraced as a vital part of our worship. Now, if you're a student of mine, here's a question every test. You can fill in the blank. We will only do as well as we are taught and challenged. Is that right? Rather, there needs to be a whole lot more teaching and challenging when it comes to how we spend our money in the brotherhood. It's one of the greatest things I've ever seen of it. People did it right. When it came to Alt Road back in December 1999, I came because we were told they were going to be buying property out of Nashville Highway. They started making payments on a 10-acre plot of land, cost $114,000 in 1994. And my wife was from that community. That's why we come back to Knoxville. She wanted to go back home. She was from Carter community. That's where they bought the property. Wouldn't it be great to go back home and help them build a church like Carnes in the east side of town? I said, it sounded like a good idea to me. We got up there and finally got there 2 or 3 years. We got the property paid off. Time to move. But the elders asked this question. You know what this building's going to cost? And the people, it'd be great to move. And they did some figuring the kind of building we wanted to move into. They said, it's going to cost about $750 a week. About $3,000 a month to pay the mortgage. Y'all got that money? Now, this small, little struggling congregation, I still remember the budget then, $1,600 a week. They said, y'all want a building? The elder said. The budget next Sunday is $2,350. We're raising it up $750 a week. You want it? Show me the money. You know what? They did. They did. Went from $1,600 a week to $2,350 a week. You know what they did? Almost half the church gave up cable TV. Now that was a sacrifice. People stopped going out Sunday dinner. They'd eat bologna sandwiches. People sacrificed meals. But they did it. You know how people felt about that? We're finally able to sell our building. To know that they met that, I don't know how much percentage. To go from $1,600 to $2,350 a week. I've never seen any congregation ever go up that much, but they did that. You know why? They were challenged because they wanted it. Because they wanted to go to our community where we are now and be a church that would be a lighthouse. That would be an influence. That would be evangelistic. That's why we came up here to help them do that. And that's what they wanted to do, and they were going to do it, and they did it. They raised the money. And then, I don't know if anybody knows what happened in 2005, hurricanes hit. We thought it was going to cost about $500,000. By the time we finally got the bills, $800,000. We're going to be short. Really short. And that's where the Lord interceded. I hate for their sake, but anybody ever heard of the Mascot Church of Christ? It no longer exists. Brother Pigman knew it did exist for a while. They finally said, we're going to belly up. They sold their building in the parsonage and gave the money to us. Made up the difference. Getting that building. You don't tell me God had anything to do with that? Here were people who were challenged, and they met the challenge. Here are other issues, but God responded. And that passage there in Macedonia about the liberality, here were people, man, it was tough. If you look at the history of those Macedonian churches, they were racked by there were 3 civil wars going on at that time. It got so bad, supposedly, Rome said, you don't have to give us all the tax money for a while. You guys are hard up. And the church was too. That didn't stop them from giving. And they gave. And they took the money. Here, I want you to imagine, you got a good imagination? Imagine what it was like in the church in Judea. Poor. Things are really hard there. And they heard that Gentile Christians are bringing some money. Can you imagine what it'd be like on that Lord's Day? When they found out how much it was. The people who were wondering, where are we going to feed little Susie and Johnny? And know the church showed up with all of that money. What were they? They were Jews. Where did money come from? What kind of people? Gentiles. You think it helped them understand the universality of the church? All lessons can be learned, brother. A lot of lessons can be learned and must be learned when it comes to how we spend our money. The bond of unity can be strengthened among brethren by our giving nature. We learned that at Alt Road. There's been other challenges along the way, but we got that one figured out. We knew if we do our part, and here's something other students have heard me say this many times, it's not your ability that matters. It's your availability. You take a heart or a family or a congregation that says, Lord, here am I. We are determined to be your people. Will the Lord take care of them? The answer is yes. He'll take care of them in a great way. And so, a message of hope is what I'm supposed to finish with. Anybody think these are hard times? I mean, when I left school back in 1973, when I have a Bible study with someone, I mean, we had students come up to Wayne County, Kentucky. One Saturday, knocked doors. There were 38 Bible studies set up. I mean, that's the world back then. When I would study with people, I'd say, turn to the book of Philippians. They could turn right to it. These were Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians finding that. What do you think it's like today, somebody saying, can you find the book of Philippians? I mean, the world is different. People respected the Bible back then, even in denominations. A Bible study meant something. I could show them some things, and it would be pretty easy compared to today. Today, the church has been told, you get in the closet. Bring all these other people there out. The church is not held in high esteem like it used to be. Can we still evangelize? Can we still grow in the middle of all that? Well, the church in the first century did, brother. Rome put a bullseye on their head. And they still grew. They still grew. Started out how many men? 12 men. Common, everyday, ordinary men. But they were different. Remember what that Roman centurion said after Jesus had died? Now, there were things going on. After hearing Jesus say the things that he did, all the different people. Remember the statement out of his mouth? Truly, this man was the Son of God. Now, the disciples had run off. But after the Lord got with them and straightened them out, they were bold then. Here'd be a good study. Read the number of times boldness in preaching is prayed for or shown in the book of Acts and the rest of the scriptures. Pray for it. Paul said, pray that we might be bold. Here's Peter and John, chapter 4, boldness. Chapter 3, the preacher's sermon, it's not held in high esteem. They're the Jewish people, arrest them. Don't do that anymore. What they say? We must obey God rather than men. The church did well for a while, and by the time you get to Acts chapter 7, the closing verses, who's dying? Stephen's dying. And what happened to the floodgates of persecution then? It opened up, scattered the church. They went, Acts 8:4, everywhere, preaching the word. And somebody was converted by the name of Saul of Tarsus. What was he like? All the people that people would be least surprised by became the greatest apostle to the Gentiles. See what God does? The hero was not Saul. The hero was not Peter. The hero was our Lord, our God. And when people saw the church full of givers, people were willing to die. In fact, Jesus in John chapter 13 said, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples by the what? By the love that you have one for another. You know what the Roman world saw? They saw that. They saw that. You couldn't scare them. Put them on the floor of the Colosseum in Rome, turn the lions loose, or burn them at the stake. They didn't die yelling and screaming and cursing. They died with a smile on their face, because you know what they had to look forward to in a few seconds? Heaven. Heaven. Rome was so impressed by the 5th century, they made it their state religion. Now they warped it, but they didn't kill the church. It prospered in the midst of it. There's a guy named Vince Hefner made this statement. He said, the church fared better when it was dying on the floor of the Colosseum in Rome than when it bought season tickets and sat in the stands. You know what he was saying? When the persecution was there, the light is pretty bright. When the world gets darker, if we have the Christians, Matthew 5:16, if we're letting our light shine because we're givers, it should be pretty obvious to the world who they would want to be. So don't tell me. Don't tell me souls can't be added to the kingdom today. It happened then. It can happen now. But first, we've got to learn It's more blessed to give than receive. Thank you for your attention.